Did you all watch the landing today? The Perseverance landing?
Yeah, I didn't get any work done because had that on.
I tried to watch it. I just a little misty-eyed. It was a little hard to watch at one point somehow, but
I mean, I was sitting in the living room with my 8-year-old and my wife, and we were sitting there watching, and I looked over, and she and I were both crying, and my daughter was like, so, what now? Does it drive off? Well, like what? She was like, I'm waiting for the cool stuff to happen, and singularly unimpressed. But it was emotional.
I hope you told her about the helicopter.
There was the cinematic tension of like commencing EDL, the kind of militarized tactical crosstalk if you were watching just the raw feed with all the initials and stuff, and it's go for flight, go for launch, go for all that stuff from all the right stuff, all the right stuff and then like it's like that when you watch the Olympics and all of a sudden you're an expert in ice skating or whatever. You learn all of it as you go, and so that when it says like, okay, this is the 7 minutes where we're going to not be able to hear because of the plasma, and then like they do the thing, and it was. They actually did it as obscurely and obtusely as they possibly could and made it even better. It was Tango Delta Nominal was what they said when it touched down.
Touchdown nominal?
Touchdown nominal. It was like, it wasn't touchdown. It wasn't contact. It wasn't, Perseverance is on Mars. It was Tango Delta Nominal was the first thing they said. And they said Tango Delta Nominal and I started crying. That was it.
For me, it's the moment when the room goes from being incredibly like, they have a series of checkpoints along the way, parachute deployed, the shields dropped, all that stuff. And you see the tension drop off of each person on the desk as they go. But then there's a human thing that happens when they get the thing that they're waiting for and everybody stands up and cheers and they hug. And I think in the post brief, somebody said that it was the first time a lot of them had been in the same room for more than a year.
Not so much hugging this time. It was a lot of like cheering 6 feet apart.
But it's that thing of human, like a pinnacle of human achievement.
Totally. That like you always get a little emotional watching, seeing the awe and majesty of human potential being fulfilled. But you're not the only ones. I saw like people on my Twitter talking about like ugly crying over this thing, and I'm just like, there's like a deep well of emotion that nobody has had an outlet for the last almost a year. And I think we're just all pouring it out on this robot that is now on another planet.
And it feels like there just hasn't been talking about a pinnacle of human achievement. I feel like we've been at the nadir of human achievement for so long in so many ways, despite the incredible efforts that people put out at an individual level. Just if you spend a year literally looking at death counts and losing American cities to weather and bureaucratic sociopolitical failure, and just like these catastrophic, science fiction scale jackpot apocalyptic feeling things, and you get like, okay, we got to win.
Well, I mean, and you could argue that the vaccine. I mean, I would argue that the vaccine development in this developing a new kind of vaccine in an incredibly short period of time and getting it deployed to, hundreds of thousands of people at this point, and hopefully, millions by the summertime, tens and hundreds of millions by the summertime is an incredible achievement. But it's also not the kind of thing that you can like. You don't, it's not like they got the vaccine out and all of a sudden 300 million people were vaccinated, or 7 billion people were vaccinated all at once. And this is all behind us. Like that's going to be a multi-year process. And there's no there's no TD nominal.
NASA doesn't animate a 6 CG simulation of somebody getting a vaccine, So there's not a lot that compares to the visual of a robot landing on another planet.
I have a small amount, it's probably not a small amount. I have some amount of cynicism about the way NASA does play that stuff. NASA's very good at telling its own story in a way that a lot of scientists aren't. Maybe this is a positive way to think about it. A lot of scientists and technologists are not great at telling their own stories. NASA is supremely good at telling its own story, and they have such a great story to tell. It is such a great story. It's an achievement, and there's going to be science, and they hold out the promise of maybe finding something once lived on Mars. I love that. I love there to be for there to have been aliens, but I like just doing geology up there, areology up there. The science is so incredible, and and I think you're right. Like the story also of the vaccines, of this incredible amount of understanding of COVID-19, of SARS-CoV-2 that's happened over the past year, is one of an emergent catastrophe of people racing against time. It's the drama of like what the failure looks like. Everybody can tell, whereas this seems like an unalloyed success. It's not in response to, all the other failures of trying to get to Mars or something.
I just have to say, I hope poor little Perseverance never hears this conversation, because we're putting an awful lot of pressure on that little robot on its first day.
Man.
Well, and you know, when you look at this the rocket that took Perseverance to Mars launched after the quarantine started. Like, the project was obviously in development for a really long time beforehand, but like, next time you're at your school board meeting or you're at the, you know, your corporate offices and somebody's like, well, you know, it's really hard to do stuff during the time of the Rona, then you point at Mars. You're like, hey man, if they can do it, you can too.
Vaguely wave your arms in the direction of the sky.
Yeah.
There's a robot up there. We could, yeah, no, I've been talking to I'm writing a story about it. I've been talking to a couple of the scientists who worked on a specific part of the project and listening to them talk about sort of how long they worked on it and what they were trying to do and how it felt. It really is. It's another one of those things that on the one hand, it took them 7 years. And on the other hand, we watched it take half an hour. Like, are they going to pull it off at the last moment when it really counts? And
like, I got to imagine what the headspace is like when you've worked on this for 7 years, and if the next 20 minutes goes well, you got the next 10 years planned. And if it doesn't, you're like, well, what's up with the Europa?
Start making some other plans.
Welcome to Brad and Will Made a Tech Pod. I'm Will.
I'm Brad.
Brad, we have a special guest today.
A special guest.
A special guest. All of our guests are special, but this is a special guest. Joining us today is a friend of mine, Adam Rogers, who is the author of Proof, The Science of Booze, and the upcoming Full Spectrum, How the Science of Color Made Us Modern, as well as being a senior correspondent at Wired. We're going to talk about booze today with Adam. Welcome to the show, Adam Rogers.
Thank you very much. I am delighted to be here. We're
so glad to have you. It's so nice to have guests in the weird times that we're living in right now. But longtime listeners will remember that I think 5 or 6 years ago when Proof came out, we sat down at a bar in Oakland and talked about the science of booze. And I could have gone on for another 2 hours probably, because it was a lovely chat. And so here we are. We're gonna talk about the science and technology behind making alcohol.
One of my favorite subjects. The thing about talking about it in a bar is that it gets kind of rate limited. It has a limit, like, because the quality of conversation declines at a certain slope that has some relationship to how long you sit at a bar and actually indulge in the bar. The actuallys get worse and louder. So
Hang on, I have to ask, were you guys also indulging in the product or just the decor?
I think we recorded at 10 o'clock on a Monday morning, maybe. I can't remember. It was really early.
So yes.
Yeah. Okay. Those weren't club sodas is what I'm saying.
What better time? I mean, I love booze. I'm not going to lie. I enjoy drinking. I like high-end alcohol. I had to have, I feel like, maybe a complicated relationship with alcohol over the last year or so.
Yeah, that as all of us did, yeah.
As it becomes less of a social experience and more of a solitary one, but I know that's maybe a little bit of a dark way to start this off, but
no, it was weird too, because when I was reporting the book, my tolerance and my relationship with it changed as well. You know, it was less, and that was a long time ago. Now it's really not great. Like it's not as much fun as it was. The science is still really fun. I'm still fascinated by it, but the actual consumption of it at 50 now is less fun than it was at 35 when it was awesome.
Well, the thing I've found, I mean, yes, there's an overindulgence. The suffering related to overindulgence is much worse now than it was 5 or even 15 years ago. But now when we're quarantined, the places that I really enjoy having a drink, whether it's, stopping and having a drink on the way home, after work with coworkers, or, mowing the lawn and drinking a beer, like the mowing the lawn, drinking a beer, that still happens. But like my likelihood of making a fancy cocktail beyond like a gin and tonic or maybe like an old fashioned is really low these days. Cause like that's a thing that I do socially out in public with people. And that part of our lives is gone right now if you're in a state that's managed by sane people.
A big chunk of that's right. A big chunk of the book, actually, when I try to get into the neuroscience of the experience, to what happens to your body and to your brain when you drink. So I'm sort of skipping all the first parts of it, but that's fine.
We'll talk about how awesome yeast is in a minute.
Yeah. So much of that is theater. So much of it is the environment that you're in and the context in which it's presented to you, and the whole thing of at the most basic level, the whole thing of people reporting that they enjoy an expensive bottle of wine better than a cheap one, even if it's the same bottle of wine. Or people thinking that a cocktail made at a fancy bar with a person who's doing all kinds of great, pre-prohibition bartender stuff is more fun than you doing it at home. All that goes to the effect that the experience in the room has, to the point that there are labs where people are testing these experiences where they actually build a simulated bar, and give people drinks with different amounts of alcohol in them to try to disentangle how much of the experience is that psychological, that psychoactive one of the actual chemical doing stuff to your brain, and how much of it is sitting with people you like, or sitting with people who you're sexually attracted to, hoping that they'll be sexually attracted to you, and sitting with, or with somebody who you haven't seen in a long time, and with a bartender you like at a place that you're a regular. I'm realizing as we were talking about what this year has been like, I keep thinking like, man, I really miss bars. And it's different. That feeling is really different than missing drinking in a bar. I just miss like going to the place as that third place, that place. Like I miss sitting in coffee houses too, and that I think it's been an interesting experiment in further disentangling those kinds of feelings about the whole like, the process, the milieu. I don't know. There's probably a good French word for the gestalt. It's a German word. Like the ritual and the substance and the people and all at once. Yeah.
It's interesting that you talk about the theatricality of that experience, because you hear all the time that alcohol is a depressant, but in so many situations, it is a very stimulating experience to drink. And I wonder how much of that actually is down to who you're doing it with and like what setting you're in and that sort of thing.
Yeah. And I think I think you can measure how much of it is, there's the depressive effect on your inhibitions and on the things that are making you kind of a folded up, bitter, sour person. I'm maybe just speaking for myself as a journalist, but you know what I mean? That those get depressed, and then like all the other stuff gets depressed until you get to the part where you're actually just falling asleep. Like there's that arc of what actually is getting inhibited or disinhibited. Cause like there's
an XKCD for this, I'm sure, with a bell curve
sure
on
there
it.
Is. He would do it very quickly and very funnily and much better than I did it in the book. But yes. And also there has been some good kind of sociology and anthropology that says that alcohol doesn't have any specific effects, really, that it really depends on what you're culturally sort of pre-programmed to anticipate and expect. The stuff, their expectancies is what it's called in psychology. And that's controversial. And the one thing that it certainly does do is that after a certain amount of it, it seems to make people more violent, which is a bad thing. That seems to be true across cultures. But so it's not totally clear that it's alcohol by itself as a drug, if we talk about it that way, as a depressant, but the effects that it has really depend on, how you're consuming it and who you're doing it with, and whether you wrote a book about it. I don't know.
Well, one of the things that struck me, like I didn't really appreciate that there wasn't that we don't know what the biological pathway for alcohol is really, where you can look at different other drugs and see that there are receptors that they hook on that fire with specific hormones and neuroreceptors and stuff like that. There's no easy analog for alcohol. We know what it does to your liver. We know what it does to some different organs, but we don't know why, getting drunk makes you less inhibited in some ways. And it's a weird thing, especially when it's used as much.
That's right. Unlike any other drug unlike any other recreational psychoactive chemical, people use a lot of them. But scientists understand nicotine, they understand caffeine, they understand opiates, they understand, amphetamines, all that stuff. And the analog, and there's some overlap with benzodiazepines, which is the reason that you're not supposed to take benzos at the same time as you're drinking. They're synergistic. So there's something going on there. But even that, it's still not well understood. And this is, years since I did that reporting, it's still not well done. Some of that, I think, is that in order to understand it, you got to be doing some pretty sophisticated and expensive neuroscience, and it's really hard to do real science on drinking if you're not studying abuse. There's money there's grant money to study abuse for really good reasons. I mean, it can be a catastrophic drug of abuse in the United States. It really is. But people don't study the place where the book takes place. In my head, that book takes place 2 sips into your second drink.
Okay, that makes sense.
Except for the chapter on hangovers, where that's a whole other shtick.
Sure,
but the rest of that book takes place. You've finished your first one, you've ordered the second one, and you've just taken the second sip. That's when all that book happens in that moment.
That's perfect. Like in college, I always felt like just right about a third of the way into my second beer was when I was the best at pool.
That's exactly right.
Always the sweet spot in the bar.
You can speak whatever language you've been studying and failing the classes. You can if your pool game gets better, the jokes get funnier.
Talk to anybody in the bar, no problem. Can we talk about the Hildegard Heyman tasting study stuff? Because that is, I think that was the most interesting, like, hard science stuff that came out of the book when I read it, and how she set up a tasting lab at Davis and recruited people to develop like an ontology of flavor in, I guess, wine in this case. But
yeah, I am really compelled by the problems inherent in creating heuristics of the senses. It's not just true for smell and taste, although smell and taste are a big one. But if you, as a huge digression, because it's related to the next book, to the color book, I tried to look into some of this for thinking about color, about the creation of color orders or color spaces, to try to figure out what are the basic colors, basic color terms, or basic colors that people can see, and what order do you put them in, and how do you create a chart, a graph, an illustration that says here's what order they go in and here's how to find all the colors. And people have been trying to do this for since the Middle Ages. The first ones were like charts of urine with different colors of darkness in order. And you can try to do that with color. It's really, really difficult, and you end up with these 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional, multi-dimensional color spaces, because you have to account for sort of how much light is coming out or how much reflection there is. You have to account for how saturated the color is. You have to account for what wavelength it is, a whole bunch of different factors. Well, if you try to do that with taste and smell, especially because taste is much more complicated, it's almost impossible to build one of those spaces. So what the people who study flavor and aroma will do is they'll make like these wheels of of different specific aromas. Really, taste is a pretty limited sense. It just has kind of 4 or 5 receptors on the tongue for this bitter and sour and sweet and salty, and maybe like umami, which is that meaty flavors, glutamate. And then there's all these other perceptions, all these other things you can perceive that are more trigeminally based. They're a nerve. So that's things like the cold of mint, or the heat of a chili pepper, or the kind of the vibrational shock of Szechuan peppers, which has a little bit of a zap to it. Those are all a different set of receptors, but also in the mouth. And there's also strain gauges that do things like texture, whether it's viscous or not. And then nobody knows how many aromas, because those are the actual chemicals, the actual molecules volatilizing and then attaching to a sensory epithelium kind of right behind your nose, up above your mouth, and somehow transducing those signals. Nobody knows what those signals are, somehow getting transduced into neural signals that go into the olfactory cortex. And so when we talk about what that actually is, if you and I say, okay, well, that smells like, and this is stuff that we talked about at Davis, that smells like apples. Well, on the one hand, I say that to you, and we all get in our heads like, okay, apple, I got it, apple. But then I say, well, green or red? Crap, okay. And then I say, well, stewed or fresh cut or baked or Granny Smith or Rome or Macoun or Empire or Pink Lady, whatever. And all those, I say all that stuff, and it all starts snapping in your head, right? And even though you and I even though I might be able to say to you, like a fresh baked apple, like baked apples in an apple pie, you and I will both have a perception in our heads of that, and it'll still be different. So what they were trying to do there was get like agreement, essentially have a test group that would all agree, like, okay, I brought in samples. We all agree that when all of us say dried apricot, this is what we mean, right? Everybody goes, right. And you sort of go through and come up with, 3 dozen of those and then say, okay, now we're ready to taste some wine and see which one of those is in there. All those things have this, what's called an object metaphor problem, which is that we are saying this is a smell that smells like that thing. It's not the smell. It's not that thing. And even if we can agree on which chemical we're talking about, which we really can't because it's a complicated collection. And when you get into something like wine or beer or whiskey, whatever, there's peaks in the gas chromatograph that nobody knows what they are, and they're all combined with each other. We're still not really saying this is what that smell is. There's no smell word we're using. We're still comparing it to the actual chemical. So we're not really communicating the science that we're trying to get at.
Well, and even in those groups, you still had a spectrum of capabilities where they could all, like, when they trained the panels, they would go take them in and then they'd test them on different flavors and they'd come up with consensus, right? Independent of each other, which kind of answers the, can you actually detect the notes of flavor within something complicated like wine or coffee or beer or whatever?
Yeah, but the consensus is limited in its vocabulary, what you can articulate. One of the main differences that anybody's ever found between like my ability to taste wine and a trained international sommelier, somebody who's been through that whole program and who's really good at it. The only difference that anybody's ever been able to identify, it doesn't mean there aren't others, but the difference people have been able to identify between my ability to discern all of those aromas and that person is that they know more words to describe those aromas. Part of that training is to be able to put those words into, so the kind of the like silly wine language that we all get used to making fun of, sort of, insouciant notes of slate and clay with a finish of orange rind and the punitive sense of having done wrong in one's elementary school, like that kind of stuff. It's all the putting aside the really ridiculous ones, the being able to say, well, that's the smell of fresh baked bread. That's a super evocative thing to be able to say. And all of us have had beers that we go like, oh yeah, fresh baked bread. Yeah. Totally.
Well, and to your point, my idea of what fresh baked bread smells like is like a yeasty, warm, like it's like the thing I'm thinking of. The smell I'm thinking of is a warm smell, right? It's not warm is not a smell, but it smells like warm yeast and like carbon dioxide basically. And yeah, it's almost magical because when you describe the flavors, you can't help. It's like telling somebody not to think about an elephant. And then, they're obviously thinking about an elephant.
It's worse than that. You can incept people with them. And I can hand you a glass of wine and say, you're going to taste blackberry and a bit of kind of a spring, like a early rain, cherry blossom sort of smell. And then there's a bit of there's like a floral at the front, and then that'll be more honey-like. If I do that, if I say that to you before I give you the wine, I guarantee you're going to taste that stuff, unless it's way the hell off. Unless the thing's
this does taste like rain.
Yeah, this is amazing. Wow, rain's fantastic.
I'm sorry, I was going to ask. I mean, do you think anybody can be trained to perform that kind of analysis, or is that dependent on having some kind of like inborn perfect palate? It sounds like you probably lean toward the former.
There's got to be a range of ability, in this same way that all of us have sort of a different sensorium. It's just very hard for us to communicate each other's sensoriums to each other, right? But we all have this the universe of senses that we live in, and it'll have different ranges in the same way that probably the photoreceptors in our eye are seeing sort of colors a little bit differently than each other's because of how many there are and where they are and how they're built. But I also think you can train somebody to be better at describing what they're perceiving, especially over the course of drinking of that sort of course of like, okay, I pour it, I smell it, take a second, I take a small sip, have it in my mouth for a minute, swallow that, wait a second, smell it, take another sip, hold it in my mouth a little bit, smell it. Like over that course, that experience, you can get better at describing all of that. Can you remember all of that and then be able to do that test that the sommeliers do where you taste 20 wines, go like, oh, well, that's the 1974 Somme, from the Rhone, that's obviously from the North Banks or whatever. Like, can you train somebody to do that? I don't know. I mean, I've tried that. I'm terrible at that.
Let's see. Do we want to talk about yeast a little bit? Yeast is yeast, like the story of your book is in a lot of ways for me the story of yeast because I hadn't fully appreciated the miracle that is this little fungus.
I'll tell you a funny story. When I wrote it, I think the first version of it, the very first thing I said, like the lead for that chapter or whatever, was something about how it's basically like, I think it was something like, you know what a babblefish is? You know, in Hitchhiker's Guide, there's a babblefish. It's like it's such an amazing, useful, and it's a mirror. And I went through the whole joke, like I did the whole riff, basically just copy pasted it out of Hitchhiker's Guide. And my editor was like, "Yeah, so I don't know if everybody's gonna really get that, and maybe you want to do that later." Like, no, but it really is like the babblefish. You know, God disappears in a poof of logic. Like, she's like, "Yeah, no, I think you want to wait."
You got to disprove the existence of God using yeast later in the book. That's like a chapter 3 or 4 thing, not in the introduction.
Not right at the top. That's off-putting.
But no, I think to me, the idea that as recently as 500 years ago, we didn't know what yeast was, but somehow we'd been making booze for 10,000 years at that point is an incredible thought. Like the trial and error and the evolution of the, like, the other example I love is the olive. Like, who was the person that looked at these horrible, bitter tasting fruits on the ground and thought, oh, you know what? If we put this in a bucket with salty water for a few weeks, these things are going to be delicious. Like, right. How do you get from the terrible thing that tastes like poison to something that we put in all of our cocktails? And the same thing happened. The same thing happened with booze, right? Like the same thing happens with yeast.
And there's you can understand why people would believe in magic.
Yeah.
That it was transformative.
Absolutely.
This literally transformative process where you take some stuff and you leave it over there for a while. And then when you come back, it's different stuff.
And it's good. And it makes you feel good.
Right. And it actually has an effect. It does something. It makes you feel better about things. And then if you leave it in a different place, it doesn't turn into that stuff, or the stuff's not as good. So something's going on. You know, there's something, there's a force out there in the universe that's doing this. And and then to go like, can I commercialize that? You know, perhaps I could sell the stuff from over there is a whole other kind of amazing human leap. Yeah. I will say that there's the part of the book where I went and held on to that pot shard that had at the time the oldest evidence of fermentation, on it, and I had it in my hand, and just thinking like that was this supreme connection to that feeling of like, here's this thing that human beings do that they didn't know how they did it for so long. They did this magic. Nobody knew how. It was a mystery cult. And they spent a lot of time and effort doing it. This
was a shard from what, 10,000 years ago that was found in Mesopotamia?
Yeah, in Jiahu in China. It was
in China. Chinese. That's right.
And it I don't get to do that kind of stuff that often. It was really moving. To have that in hand. And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I think that, the fact that finally coming to an understanding of what yeast was and what was going on, both kind of solved and made systematic what alcohol is, what beer and wine and distilled spirits were, but then also was the beginning of biochemistry, also started a whole new science. Like, it was transformative. It was this kind of Newtonian moment, in the sciences to say, oh, there's a whole other kind of, this is how life works. It really is like a secret. There was a secret key to life that people had not understood about enzymes and about how complicated things could form and be transformed. And that all came out of trying to understand what was going on with fermentation. And in that case, it was specifically sugar beets. It wasn't just booze, but that's where that was.
I was going to ask if there's much historical insight into exactly how that process of fermentation was discovered. I mean, you hear about like, soap maybe came about through, fat and ash mixing in a river or something like that downstream, and like, I like to think that there's some cheeky happenstance where like so-and-so stumbled over a barrel and dropped some stuff in or something, but it's, with
right.
food storage and like kind of spoiling being as common as it was, I'm sure the actual answer is pretty mundane, but it's still kind of curious.
It's weird too, right? Because if you assume that it kind of happened, that they had it in the Mesopotamian cultures in the when they first settled down to do farming, the Tigris and Euphrates, Fertile Crescent stuff, and then when they were doing that in China as well, that there were all of these specific kinds of transformations of food that were going on that they wouldn't have known. They didn't know the microbiology of, but they knew they happened. So they knew that dairy products could turn into yogurt and cheese if they did if they mix them in certain ways, put them in certain places. They knew that if they ground up the barley that they were growing and mixed it with water that it would, and did something with that, it could turn into bread. And they knew that if they took fruit, they knew that fruits, but probably the fruit thing, the fermentation of fruit was probably the only one that they would have natural examples of, because that'll happen on the vine, that'll happen on a tree. And you can actually look over in the same, like you were saying, how do you ever go and say like those super bitter little olive things, well, if I just soak them in poison for a while, they'll be delicious. You could look and say, well, that fruit's been on that tree for too long. And when the birds go over there and eat it, they fall out of the sky. So something's going on and we don't know what, but something's happening. So, and I think probably, the idea that it happens to fruit first, and then you start to mess around with like, well, what if I leave out what if I do the barley water? What if I leave that out? Is there a different transformation that can happen with? You can start to imagine, I've ground up the pulp of the juice and the rice stuff and I mixed it up and I leave it in a closed container for a while. If I leave that fruit juice in that closed container for a while, sometimes it spoils and it'll make me sick if I drink it, but sometimes it makes wine, So you can start to imagine that, but those are all just so stories. And I think it's telling that in so many cultures, the literal theology of like how people were created by whatever the gods were has some involvement with barley and grain and beer and bread. It's certainly true. It's true with Egyptian theologies and myths. It's true with there's a lot of different cultures, West African myths that do that. And there's a lot of other overlaps too, but it's foundational. It's like, it's so old that they don't remember how they did it. But part of the foundation of whatever the culture that you're in was the ability to make beer and make some fermented fruit thing and make bread.
Let's see. So we've talked about fermentation a little bit. There's other stuff that people do to make booze more boozier, the distillation. And then there's a whole host of other weird things that we do. And I think it'd be interesting to talk about the kind of evolution of those processes. At what point did somebody realize, hey, we can boil off the water and the alcohol and these things at different rates and then collect the out? Like how does that process evolve?
So you go like 8,000 years of we know how to make beer and wine. Basically, we know how to make beer and we know how to make wines out of all the different fruits that we have. Because anything that's a sugar substrate, it becomes very clear. It becomes clear over those 8,000 years that anything that has sugar in it, if you expose it to the magical forces that can transform into something alcoholic, but it's got to have sugar, right? And so the problem that they have to figure out how to solve is if you have something that's mostly cellulose or starch, how do you get that to be sugar? And so there's a lot of solutions to that. Malting is the solution to that for barley and for beer. Using the koji fungus is the solution if you're trying to make sake. Chewing on it is the solution initially for making chicha, I guess.
Wait. People would take the grains and chew them up and then spit them out and ferment that?
I was just going to let that pass without comment, but now
should I come back to that?
It up. No, let's get into it.
It's one of the things actually that made when I went through some of these stories that made a very smart editor named Bill Wasik, who's at the New York Times, I'll say like, you have a book here, was me describing all of the different ways that you had to do this. If you have simple sugar in fruit, it's easy. It's hard not to make it ferment, right? If you just leave grape juice out, you're going to get wine. It'll be crappy wine, but you'll get wine. But if you have, for all these other, if you have corn, because starch is indigestible to yeast, but it's digestible to us, partially because we have an enzyme in our saliva called amylase. If we chew on corn or cornmeal and then kind of spit it out, make a little cake out of it, the sugars get open. The sugars get simpler. They're available to yeast, so the yeast can then turn that into a kind of fermented, like a corn beverage, like a beer almost. And if you're making sake or if you're making shochu, for making rice wine, you apply this domesticated fungus, just like yeast is domesticated. Some yeasts are better at making alcoholic beverages than others. Koji is a member of a family of funguses that are mostly poisonous or are actually pretty dangerous. But this one's trained. This one, we taught it to sit up for a treat. And in return, it eats some of that treat and then it excretes sugar that the yeast can get to and make alcohol. When you're trying to make any of the tequilas, the mezcals, the agave spirits, they pound the crap out of the fibers of it with those big stone crusher things or with more industrialized processes now to get literally get the molecules small enough that the yeast can eat
that's they're using a mechanical process instead of a chemical process there.
Mechanical and heat. Yeah. So there's also heat and steam involved. And that's why you get those piñas, the big roasted piñas from agave. But so you do all that for a long time. But then probably, and this is not, this history is not there. It'll turn out to be something different. Somebody will figure this out archaeologically, but at least in a couple of places, maybe in India, but almost certainly in Alexandria, the kind of science that they were doing in the big labs of Alexandria at about the turn of the millennium from BC to AD, that transition, those like few hundred years when, Antony and Cleopatra and Caesar were chasing each other around and every ship would come to Alexandria and they would kind of take all of the scrolls off of it by force and copy them and then put the scrolls back, sort of building these big libraries and research centers. One of the things that they were doing, there was a woman who sometimes in history is referred to as Maria the Jewess. Don't put that on me. I didn't do it. It's not my fault. But who invented a lot of lab gear. There's something, especially for the alchemists. So this is the basis. This research that they're doing there becomes through transitioning through the Abbasid Empire, the Caliphate, when Arab cultures were doing translations of Greek and Roman stuff. This was the beginning of that. They got some of those scrolls. A lot of them were destroyed, but they got some of them. That's the transition of that knowledge through Europe and into Northern Europe that begins the Middle Ages, begins the Renaissance essentially. And one of the
was that a technological line too? Like, was it suddenly we got good at glass blowing or metalworking and were able to make pipes and tubes and things that couldn't exist before?
Yeah, some of those technologies existed previous to that, but they were doing a lot of basic technology, like block and tackle, fine grade technological work in Alexandria for a bunch of different reasons. Some of it was because they were building early automatons. They were doing automata. They were very good at sort of steam and small pipes and wheels and gears and clockwork mechanisms. They liked all that stuff. It was really fun. So they were good at that, which meant there was the expertise in forming metal and making metal solid enough to move hot liquids and move steam. Maria, who I mentioned, created a device that's still used in labs today. It's essentially a double boiler called a Balneum Mariae or a Marienbad, the Maria's bath, right?
Oh, wow.
And one of the things that she also created was effectively a still. And she wasn't trying to do, probably the research they were doing wasn't in taking foodstuffs. It was they were using sulfur or molten metal and seeing what those vapors were. But the idea of having of exciting something so that parts of it would evaporate and then covering that up and letting that recondense into a liquid and collecting that liquid seems to have come from there. There's some evidence that there were some Indian cultures that had were doing the same thing. And then in the book I tell this joke where I'm like, well, okay, even if Maria wasn't doing it, I've been in enough labs to know that there's always beer around and postdocs are always going to try something like, I don't know, put the beer in it. Let's see what happens. Was my made up invention for distilling. But what ends up happening is that the somewhere in there, people learn to do it with alcoholic beverages also. And you can kind of see across the timeline, you can see cultures picking up the technology and skill set for distilling, moving across essentially the Silk Road, across trade routes, across Asia and into Europe. And it doesn't really turn into anything kind of commonly used until the early Middle Ages in monasteries, because they have access to all the weird herbs and stuff, because every monastery probably had medicinal herbs and they were helping travelers and things. And it becomes something that's medical. So to me, one of the reasons that I really like chartreuse or Benedictine, these sort of weird digestifs, is that I have this sense, and I read that like chartreuse is probably as close as anything gets to what the first spirit would have been like, what the earliest distilled something. Like if you showed up at a monastery that was already making beer and was working on that stuff in the back, and you were saying, I don't feel that good, they might bring you a glass of that, and it would be something that would be very much like green chartreuse. So I like that idea.
So okay, that leads to an interesting question. We've spent the last 10,000 years domesticating the yeast, or sometimes not intentionally not domesticating the yeast, but there's cross contamination both ways as this progresses, and we've been domesticating the fruit and the grains as well. how much different is stuff that we're making today? Is beer and wine and spirits that we're making today going to taste than it did, 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 years ago? Do we have any idea? Is that a thing we can know?
It's a fascinating question. There are people who have worked on trying to take the old recipes, that you find on a Assyrian stele or whatever, and make the recipe and try to make the beer. But of course, the substrate material, the barley might taste different, or so you don't know exactly what it'll be. I think it's probably a good guess to think that wine tastes pretty close. The way the Romans made wine, the Romans had a pretty evolved wine culture. It's probably pretty close, although they weren't aging it really yet, or if they were aging it, it was in ceramic and was underground. So they were getting oxidative aging, but not the extractive aging from wood. There's not great history on when barrel aging started as an intentional practice. There are people who know a lot more about this than I do, and I couldn't really get them to tell me anything because some of it's proprietary. But because they want to know for their own, because they're like, they're doing the research at distilleries that they. But like when did they start? When did it become? The Romans transported wine in amphorae, big vases. At some point,
clay vases.
Yeah, ceramic. Stoneware,
okay.
Right? Not porcelain, but some, ceramic, the watertight ceramic,
right?
And so you get some aging, and in fact, you can. I've now tasted some mezcals that were made in a clay still, so not in a metal one, and the material of the still is super important to how the stuff tastes. Typically, they use copper because copper transfers heat really well. Gold and silver will be better, but they're too expensive. So copper is the one that's affordable, and you can work it. You can make the shape, and the shape matters if you're doing a still of a certain kind. But also copper will pull sulfur out, and the sulfur compounds are off flavors in distilling. They're gross. Sulfur is the same thing. Garlic and onion flavors are sulfur flavors, so you get a sense of what that would be like.
Spoiled eggs.
Yeah, right. But you don't have to use copper to do distillation, and so I finally got to taste a couple of years ago a mezcal that was made in a clay still, and it was really wonderful. But you could taste the earth. I mean, it was earthy, and not earthy the way peat, not like a peat whiskey is earthy, but like no, that tastes like clay. I can taste it. It was remarkable. It was really fun to taste. So and in the aging process, which is a whole other separate piece of chemistry, there's kind of two parallel chemical processes going on with aging the way we do it now, because if you're doing it in wood, there's an extractive process. The booze spends all this time sloshing up against the wood and kind of going into the outer layers of it and coming back out, and it's picking up all kinds of flavors from essentially the decomposing cellulose and other stuff in the wood, and you get flavors like those sort of coconut fatty flavors from the wood. Or if you've had, everybody sort of jokes about the oaky Chardonnays of the 90s, but people remember those white wines like, well, that tastes like, I feel like I'm chewing on a plank, but there are also these oxidative aging processes that are not extractive, but where the chemicals themselves are spending just enough time in contact with each other that they're changing and new chemical species are being formed all the time. So the Roman wine would have had the oxidative stuff, and they had like 100-year-old wine. Was the pinnacle, but it wouldn't have any extractive flavor changes. So, you could get a 100-year-old bottle of wine now if you had the money and were willing to crack it open, but it wouldn't taste like Roman 100-year-old wine would. I suspect that something like a brandy that you would get now probably tastes like those early burnt vines that were the first brandies that came out around Europe in the 1400s or something. That's probably closer, but to try to recapture the flavor of, something from thousands of years ago there's two I would like to taste. I've never had these, but I've only read about them, and I feel like they're probably pretty close to what some early booze flavors would have been. Some of them are the palm wine species. In various parts of Western Africa, there's a lot of palm wines, and it's the particular species of plant that then they are fermenting with wild type yeasts. So it's not like a controlled domesticated Saccharomyces cerevisiae. It's much more like not even like the really pleasant but weird yeast that they'll use in a lambic or something, but really like gross yeast doing really weird stuff. So
are they fermenting the dates? Or are they fermenting something else?
Some of them are date. Some of them are like there are other fruits that are growing on the palm, I think. And it's a particular species. It's not palm trees like in LA. It's some other plant. Yeah. And they're very potent, and they're like fatty, and they form like microbial mats on the top because there's other stuff. There's other flora besides other microflora besides the yeast that get involved. I'd like to taste those. They're supposed to be, to our palates, not great, but I want to taste them. And then also the kumis, which is fermented mare's milk. The horse is the only mammal whose milk has enough sugar that a yeast will ferment. Cows, there's just not enough sugar in there, at least that the yeast have access to. So it's supposed to be like a boozy yogurt, basically, like and gloppy, and again, texturally.
Have you tried that?
No, I've never had it. I haven't had either of them, and I really want to because I feel like those are close to what you would be talking about. Those are ancient techniques that are still practiced.
Brad, you want to let's talk about stills. You have still questions, I think.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask an aging question before we move on. Although, I mean, these are all of a piece. I guess it's all a process. We're just kind of discussing it out of order. But I'm curious if is the aging process arrested once you bottle the final product and it's fully sealed up? Because I'm always really curious about the odd story you'll see about like case of 500-year-old wine unearthed intact from a shipwreck, or like this 2,000-year-old booze from some tomb or something. You know what I mean? Like,
like
I'm always curious about what has happened to that substance in all that time. But because it's not exposed to air, I don't know what's going on in there.
So what the received wisdom in that is, and I don't know if it's totally true. The received wisdom is anything that's more than about 30%. Anything that's more than the proof that you would get a whiskey at now, that's 40% alcohol, 80 proof, right?
80 proof, yeah.
Anything at that or a little bit higher, once it's closed, that's it. And that'll stay in that bottle forever. And you won't get much change in flavor, if any. Once it's exposed to air, it'll start to oxidate again. And it'll take time, but like people who keep bottles of brown liquor for a long time will be like, if you get down to about 2/3, or if you get down to about 1/3 full, you probably want to drink that or do something with it, because it's not going to be, 20 years, it's not going to keep. I have tasted very, very old whiskey that had been opened or exposed to air, and it got gross.
Like how just didn't taste like whiskey, or it actively tasted?
I've had this twice. And the one time I had a very old Isla, which are the very peaty, the sort of famously like bong watery, earthy, peaty flavory whiskeys from Scotland. And once I had one that was old enough where you couldn't taste the peat anymore. It was just gone.
Wow.
It was just like, and I mean, I was being self-effacing about my ability to do that kind of sommelier thing with wine. I'm actually okay with whiskey. Like I can do that a little bit. And I was shocked. It was just gone to the point where I was like, what's the point of this now?
How old are we talking? Do you know?
It was
offhand?
More than 50 years.
Okay.
And I had another, I did have one that was, I can't remember even what the label was now. That was much older. It was, sort of 70 years old or something. And it just didn't taste good anymore. Like the pleasantness of it was gone. It was almost acrid. It was fun to try it. It was like, oh, that's cool. It's like, oh no, that doesn't taste good anymore. Stop showing off, rich guy who owns this. But it's not, I mean, congratulations, but your booze doesn't taste good. It's weird too. And all different distilled spirits age differently as well. Whiskey, to me, like, how snotty can I get? A whiskey that's more than 50 years old, it's really gone off a cliff. That's not, you don't want that anymore.
Not worth drinking.
Why would you even? But cognacs, but French style brandies. As a person I talked to who makes a French style brandy here in California, said to me, like, they're only starting to get good at about 50 years in the barrel. Like about 50 years in the barrel, then they're really starting to come into their own. 75. Now you're talking.
So what's the difference there?
Well, right. What's the difference? What thing in it is getting good versus getting bad? Right. Yeah. I think what starts to happen is with whiskey, you start to lose flavors. All this stuff, all these things are volatiles. Right. This is all about
meaning they go away if exposed to the atmosphere for indefinite. Yeah.
Yes. Essentially, some molecules are lighter than others. The whole reason a still works is that some molecules are lighter than others, so that when you heat it up, some of them evaporate first. And when you take beer and you heat it up for a while and put it in through a still, what the lighter molecules are like the alcohol and not the water, which stays behind, and all the things that make whiskey taste the way it does, except for the stuff that makes whiskey brown or taste like wood, because that's all extractive. That comes later. So if you've ever had moonshine or white dog or something that came right out of a still or unaged, or even an eau de vie or any unaged spirit, you know what that tastes like. That comes right off that you get that heat, but also sometimes a very intense. If you have a good apricot eau de vie or a good pear eau de vie, like that's like drinking the spec to me. That's like you taste something like, well, that's the perfect apricot, and I want to have that in my mouth all the time. Like that's perfect. Because some of those flavors, those evanescent flavors that are when you bite into that apricot on a perfect summer day when you're a kid, that go up your nose and when the juice runs down your mouth and all that, like those flavors are all captured and locked into that for a while. And they can go away. They'll evaporate over time, especially if that stuff's exposed to air. I have also had a 50-year-old whiskey where they did that thing where like, oh, they found it. It was, it got caved in the Blitz, and then they found it in England and there was a barrel still there. And that was fantastic. Like I can still taste that. It was amazing. It had been in the barrel and then they bottled it. Right. So it had been aging in the barrel for, since World War II. And then they bottled. And I've had a rum like that too. And it was really pretty lovely. But wine, because the alcohol level is lower, that oxidation will kick in sooner. And also the cork is supposed to let a little air, and there's supposed to be some air getting in there like that, even though there's a capsule on it that should stop that. So wine, it'll oxidize and go bad sooner. Nobody really thinks about like drinking any of those wines from Thomas Jefferson's wine cellar or whatever. They trade them because they're old and they're antique, but they don't get drinking. They will not be drinked by you. Yes. I will say that one of the things I like about going to distilleries is that you get to smell and sometimes taste all of these moments in the process that you can then, if you taste the final product, smell and taste again.
This is since we spoke, I've been on a distillery tour, because I think when we talked last time, I'd gone to Jack Daniel's as a kid, but not when I was old enough to do anything fun there.
Right.
And I was in Kentucky a few years ago and got to go on the tour at Woodford, which is like a big industrial tour through a historical barn that is like Disneyland for booze, kind of, in a 3-hour trip.
That's exactly right. Yes.
But it was amazing because you can sit and you're in these old barns and you're looking at these big casks that are made out of wood, and they're set up in a thing that looks like it's been there for 200 years. And then when you walk out of that building and look up the hill, you see warehouse after warehouse after warehouse of aging racks where they take the product that comes out of the industrial version of this, and you get to go the whole thing. So there's a real weird dichotomy there between, hey, here's the way somebody probably did this 200 years ago, 150 years ago. And then also, by the way, we make 50,000 gallons of this stuff a year or whatever it happens to be.
I'm always so frustrated at the way the American whiskey business especially refuses to acknowledge that they're a chemical factory. Because that doesn't offend me. I eat a lot of processed food. And the fact is, like, Wild Turkey, makes hundreds of thousands of gallons of booze every year, and it's delicious. That is a fantastic product. But they would like to pretend that it's, Uncle Billy Jack up the hill with a still the size of a television, on the run from the revenuers or something. And that's who's making this stuff. And like, no, that's not. You guys are sophisticated chemists. You're sophisticated chemists. Own up. Yeah.
The thing you have to remember is that they shot the engine room scenes from the Star Trek reboot in the Budweiser brewery in St. Louis, right? Like it's high tech stuff. It's cool. Show us the cool side.
Yeah, let me see it. And to be able to have the high tech stuff and then turn it into a thing where you can, if you're really good at it, you can sort of taste what's coming off the line. You can smell what's coming off the line and go, uh-oh, there's a problem at unit 7, of the, like we gotta get another double bang of copper in there. It's not coming out right. It's fascinating.
at the same time, it was also fascinating to stand in the old barn and smell the stuff that was fermenting in these big 500-gallon tanks and realize that, oh, right, I know this smell. This is the smell that I know is in here.
Yes.
And that was amazing because I didn't expect that at all.
Yeah, that's a wonderful moment for me. I get it. And I get it every time I get the opportunity to go into an aging, to a rick house or a warehouse. I forget, and then I walk in and I go, oh, right. Oh, yeah, that's lovely. That's beautiful. Yeah. It's really nice.
As much as it is a kind of exacting chemical process, I find the aging part so fascinating because it's so immovable, like there's no shortcutting through it, like you can't rush the passage of time. You just kind of have to wait. And it seems like it would make the R&D process of making better whiskey like the most languid process on the planet. I've heard it said before that like your master distiller or whatever you call them is going to get basically 2 full runs of product in their entire career or something like that.
They'd love to speed it up. There's a lot of science to try to get that to go faster, and they won't.
Interesting.
They won't really. So you can either try to come up with some fancy chemical thing, and there's a few folks who do that. There was just a good article about some of the recent ones where you try to, and basically what you can do is you can figure out ways to speed up the extractive part. Very hard to figure out how to speed up the oxidative part. So you end up with like a lot of, for a while in the, when the book came out, especially 10 years ago, it's a little less true now. All these small distilleries were spinning up, and in order to have product out the door quickly, they would age in smaller barrels. So it would be the same color. It would look like whiskey, and it would taste mostly like whiskey, but it would also taste to me very green. There was this, it was like a cedary, resinous, flavor. And that was the extraction without the oxidation. There's very few places that are still selling that. Most of that didn't taste good, so they didn't sell it. And a lot of the places that wanted to stay in the business made it 10 years, made it to 8 years when their stuff was starting to come online that was actually spending 8 years in a barrel like it was supposed to. But yeah, there are also, there are some of the big distilleries will do climate controlled chambers, instead of having the barrels essentially in what is for all intents and purposes an open warehouse where the air and temperature is not controlled, air comes in and out, where they'll try to control the temperature and the humidity in different ways and see if they can move it faster. They'll move the barrels to see if they can get more exposure to the wood over a certain amount of time. All these things, there are things they can control a little bit. To my knowledge, they've never improved on it. You also use different woods. You can try different flavors.
Put the barrels on a paint shaker. Just let it rip, really agitate the hell out of it.
Put them on a boat, age it at sea. They do that too.
That's right. And I'm not convinced. See, this is where I lack faith. I lack the faith of my convictions. To me, I will taste those and think, nah, it didn't make any difference. But I've seen people be able to taste differences that I believe in. I tell this story all the time. I probably told it last time we talked too, but I went out once. It's probably 20 years ago now, went out with a bunch of master distillers to a dinner, and we went to a place that had a pretty good whiskey list. And I knew the list also. At that point, I was drinking enough of it that I was like, yeah, I know these. And the guy I was sitting next to was like, I think the master distiller from Woodford at the time. Oh yeah, we'll have that, and that. He did one of those things like those guys were like, and I was like, okay. I was like, I think I'm going to be able to do this when these show up. I think that you put those in front of me, and I might not know 2, but I'll take a guess. But I know those 3 pretty well. I'm ready to play. Deal me in, guys.
I'm a big kid. I can do this.
I can do this. I'm a professional booze writer, and the wait person came with the tray and had the 5 glasses, these 5 Amarco liquors. And the guy looked at him and went like, that one's that one, that one, that one, and that one. By sight. And I was like, I fold.
That's a lifetime of experience.
Yeah, it was amazing.
These things really ebb and flow in that market, right? And I have to assume a lot of that is based on supply, right? Because you can't just gin up more. Gin is not
gin. You can gin up.
You can gin up gin, yeah.
But you can't just conjure more of whatever's hot, like rye or whatever it is right now on a lark, right? Like I have to assume the market follows.
Yeah, but the marketing's pretty big. It is true, and there have been times when like there wasn't enough of a particular brand because it got really popular. But then there was that whole thing, that Pappy Van Winkle 25-year-old thing where everybody, all the, sort of stockbroker types wanted to be drinking that. And you go like, the way this business works, like if you buy this other whiskey, if you buy this other American bourbon, that's Pappy with a different label on it. And you get that at 18 years old and it's $100 less a glass. You could get that. They just weren't there. People are interacting. It's that theater thing again that we were talking about at the top. People are interacting with the label and with I'm ordering because because I know stuff about it. And I've got my own version of that too, right? I walk into a bar with back in the old days when people walked into bars, and with people and I stand up sort of on the rail and look over and look for the weird stuff. I'm like, okay, what are they? And then and I do that thing and by that time people are looking at me because now I'm the guy who wrote the book about booze and like, oh, well, what's going on over there? And that's the thing. And then I feel like I'm a big shot and I got to show off. And it that's
you're the guy figuring out what's next at that point. But
right.
I mean, I guess like Japanese whiskey occupied that niche pretty recently in stuff like Yamazaki 12 and 18 and stuff, right, where it's $150, $200 a bottle now. But I talked to somebody who worked for a supplier who was like, oh yeah, I remember when that stuff was $50 and it's fine. It's, it's more about the image and the rarity of it at this point that's driving those prices.
I'll tell you one of those stories about me in the opposite direction. I was in a very good whiskey store that had, this is a long time ago now when Yamazaki 18 was just coming online and they had it and I was talking to the guy and he said, have you had it? I said, yeah, I've had it. I have to tell you, it's, and I think this was actually being racist. I think I was actually being racist when I said that. It just feels kind of programmatic to me, though. It just feels really rigid. It's just it's so structured, and the sort of flavors come in these beats that are so. And he just looked at me, he's like, "You're crazy. It's delicious. What's the matter with you? You're nuts." I was like, "Okay, fair. Sorry." And he's right.
He just had one of those palates, I guess.
No, he was right. I was being a
do you have any thoughts on, this seems like the perfect time to ask about this. Do you have any thoughts about, I guess this qualified as a minor scandal a few years, scandal's a strong word, but a few years ago I'm talking about MGD and all the they're factory producing the distillate in mass quantities and selling it to these tiny distilleries that are maybe aging it or blending it and just slapping a label on it, but it's all actually coming from the same place in Indiana.
I'll tell you the funny thing about that when that story came out is that a lot of the rest of us who'd written about booze were really mad that we hadn't written it because it was not a secret.
Oh, wow.
The booze people knew it. We just forgot that nobody else knew it.
Wait, so you're saying you go to the booze, the distillery trade show and there's a big MGD booth that's like, hey, we can get you your truckloads of distillate for that's how they were. Yes, that's how they were presenting it. It's a great story. The reason why, so they were, it was a massive chemical production facility, and they were making stuff that would be used in from industrial alcohol to neutral grain spirits to the thing that was going to be 50% of a Canadian rye, all that other stuff. They were making any of those things, and it was owned by Seagram initially, and then Edgar Bronfman Jr., the scion of the Seagram fortune, decided that he wanted to make movies. And so he went and bought Universal Studios, I think it was Universal's MCA, and totally failed, tanked it, lost a ton of money. And the family was like, welp, guess we got to sell some rye. So They started selling the stuff, and it wasn't all the same. By the time any of us drank it, it wasn't the same anymore because they would do stuff to it. So they would finish it in different kinds of barrels, or they would have they would say well, we've got this batch and this batch, we can mix those together, or you can mix it together with this other batch that you get from somewhere else. But what was happening is that thing that we were talking about before about how a distillery in Kentucky will make a big deal out of their rural and pastoral and whiskey rebellion past when they've actually got a big factory down the road. Here, there were places that didn't have a distillery at all. They were just essentially, as a great whiskey writer would call them, Potemkin distilleries. They were they were a label and a bottling facility essentially, and they were buying stuff. And then a couple of them, it turned out a couple of them were adding flavors, not just mixing with other ryes, but were going to a flavor company and buying rye flavor or some other flavors and adding that to make the product.
That's the Cheetosification of whiskey, to tie it back to another recent episode.
But here's the thing about that it's the reason that we bridle at that is that it offends our sense of authenticity, but it still tasted good. we're making a connection. We're making important a connection that maybe isn't that important. That if you could, because what may be true is that somebody could, for very cheap, make a rye-like liquid that you could buy and that would taste delicious, but it would be the equivalent of Coca-Cola. You know, it would be like the most commodified stuff in the world. It would have no what Philip K. Dick called historicity, right? It would have no historicity behind it. And so we would say like, well, you can't do that. That's not okay. That's terrible. It's supposed to be, look, it's only champagne if it's from the French region of sparkling, otherwise it's just sparkling rye. You know, that's what that joke is about, right? And I don't know if that's true or not. And I tell these stories all the time, and I like sitting there with my fancy glass and a glass of whiskey that I can tell a story about. But there's a difference. There's some difference, and we don't make the difference anymore. We mix together, we blend together what the thing tastes like and smells like to us, and the experience that we have when we consume it, and the story that we then tell about it. And I suppose that's how branding works. I mean, I'm a reporter, and so that doesn't make any sense to me. But I think that's what that is. It
sounds dangerously like a branding exercise. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry.
I think you've outlined some legitimate reasons that that's important to people. You know, like it does provide sort of a straight through line to like a more agrarian past. You know, when people touched the land and lived off the land more, and you know, like knowing that it underwent all those natural processes, and I think again crucially had to sit somewhere for a very long time, is very meaningful to a lot of people. I
think that's right, and I think that gets braided with the experience that we have when we drink it. So I think I tell this joke in the book, but like that one bottle of wine that you had in that one little trattoria in Florence, with your romantic partner before you were legally partnered, but when you had just met and this was your first trip and it was raining out and you ducked into this one little place and you had the perfect bolognese, and it's probably not bolognese in Florence, sorry, but like that one moment, that lives large in your memory, and then you find that wine, again, the same year, same winery, whatever. I promise you it's not as good if you have it sitting on the couch. Well,
and but at the same time, sometimes that same bottle of wine will evoke the same sense memory that you had when you drank it the first time.
You're absolutely right. And as soon as I said what I just said, I realized like, but also maybe it would be just as good. Maybe it would remind you of that moment and it would be even better because you would think, man, this is just like that time. I'm so glad to be with you. Right. Like it would do that too, maybe. Yeah, I mean, right.
Look, it can go either way. It depends on how it worked out, right? I think that's as good a place as any to wrap up. Brad, you got any other closing thoughts?
I mean, I could sit here and ask questions all day, but they're all going to be about whiskey, which starts to feel self-indulgent at some point. So,
I think that also, I will say just at the end of that, I think that world is pretty different, even than when I was writing about it. I think that world of kind of single malt whiskeys coming out of small distilleries, it's not really what it was. It all got sort of bought by the big transnationals and
that was something Will had written down. Yeah, the consolidation. Like, do you have any thoughts on how that's affected things? I guess so.
Well, it makes me sad. I think there's only a few whiskeys that I'm that interested in. I don't drink a lot of whiskey anymore because it costs a lot of money and it's just not my thing as much anymore. But I still love it. And every time I do have one that is really, really good, I think like, why do I not drink this anymore? Because I really love it. But like there's a distillery that no longer exists. And when I first went to Scotland, with my dad, this is one of those stories like the trattoria in Florence. My dad and I went to Scotland to taste whiskeys before I was in my 20s. Before I was going to write a book. I didn't know I was going to write a book about it. We just went. It was a trip I took with my dad. And one of the whiskeys that we had there was called Imperial. We went to the whiskey shop in Dufton, which is in the center of Speyside whiskey trails, bought a case of different whiskeys, went in to the guy and like, I know we're American and we're stupid, but we're actually here to spend some money. What do you got? And one of the things we walked out was this stuff was from this distillery Imperial. Imperial doesn't exist anymore. Not only was it shuttered, it was destroyed. It was, razed to the ground. So there's no more Imperial. Every so often a cask shows up, like K&L in San Francisco used to get it once in a while. They get it. And so one time they had Imperial, from some independent bottler. And I bought a case basically. And these are expensive bottles for me, but I was like, I bought 12, and I still have a few. I still have like 5 bottles of this and there's no more. So I find that really romantic and moving. And I, because of that story and because I have the experience of it with my dad, and because of the experience of it, what it means, the history of whiskey, and because it's unique, and because whiskey is a thing that only human beings do and only certain human beings can make it. And it's a thing that's like a fundamental expression of human art, just like, to me, in a weird way, just like that Mars probe is. And so when I occasionally have a glass of it, and I don't save it, I don't husband it. Whiskey, action figures are for playing with, whiskey is for drinking. But I do get to think about all that kind of stuff. And there's just not a lot of that kind of whiskey left, but I think about it when I have that one.
It's the ephemeral nature of it is kind of what makes it special, right?
That's right.
That's awesome. Adam, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. What's up next? You have Full Spectrum coming out soon?
Full Spectrum comes out in May 18th. My other obsession. So at the same time as I was learning to be obsessed with booze and how it worked and what it was, I got compelled by the existence of one particular pigment, one particular thing that colors a lot of stuff that human beings make. Titanium dioxide. You know what titanium is, right? Titanium dioxide is just titanium and 2 oxygen atoms stuck together. And it is in almost everything that human beings make that has color. Like, if you look around the space that you're in right now, basically a surface that has color on it probably has titanium dioxide, because it has a very high refractive index. It's very opaque. It's very bright. And so it makes other colors brighter in paint and in dishware and in pills and in candy and in paper and in all kinds of stuff that's around us every day. So I got transfixed by the idea that there was this one thing that gave other stuff color, and the color white especially. And that turned into this exploration of the long arc, the rainbow-shaped arc of the human relationship with color and how we make it. Because there's the three-sided relationship among the kind of physics and chemistry of the universe that makes things have colors. And the way that human beings take advantage of that to make colors and make new colors and make other colors into each other, and turn that into from root code science of the universe into a technique, into a practice. And then the way the human eye and the human brain turn those into things that are colors in our minds, and how we talk about them, which is different than any other animals would have, much less what aliens would see. So I got transfixed by all of that. And now that's what's in the new book.
I can't wait to read it. People can find proof at fine booksellers everywhere. And where can they find you?
I am way too often probably on Twitter as at Jocko, JETJOCKO. And I write for Wired, so my boss is probably expecting a byline any minute now.
Well, Adam, thank you so much for taking the time. Let's buzz you out, and we'll have you back soon, I hope. And as always, we've reached the part of the episode where we thank the people who support the show on Patreon. So thanks to all of our patrons, whether you're backing at the $2 level, where you get access to the fabulous TechPod Discord, or at everybody in between, or even if you just tell your friends about the show a lot, we really appreciate it. I don't know if you were watching this morning, but the conversation that happened on Thursday morning as the Perseverance lander was coming in, we had people sitting and talking and chat the whole morning. It was a delight.
Live watch party. It was pretty exciting.
I was
extra
trying to
exciting. Not to blow our community's horn too much. Extra exciting when you have somebody who works in the building there talking about it.
Yeah, exactly. I was busy trying to impress upon an 8-year-old the level of challenge and excitement. I think the best I got was, it's like throwing a basketball from here to your grandparents' house across the country and getting a basket in.
You always have to work with metaphors they understand.
Yeah, the math isn't right, but the idea is strong, I think. As always, thank you. Special thanks to our executive producer level patrons, Cedric Katzenmacher, The Bunny Fiend, Jacob Chappell, David Allen, and James Kamek. Thank you all so much. Yes, we really appreciate y'all.
Thank you.
And we'll be back next week with another episode of the Tech Pod. Next week's episode, questions.
Yes. Oh,
we're turning questions into answers.
Oh my God. Wow. I can't believe we made it. We got back on track as intended. Emails are for the last week of the month.
techpod@content.town is the email address. We also have to come up with a Patreon episode for this month. I don't think we have any ideas on the bank, so we're going to have to come up with something good.
Okay. I got an idea.
Okay. What is it?
We open our audio editor of choice and hit record.
Just talk?
We sit in front of these microphones
Yeah.
and we talk.
People liked that last month.
That seems to work. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay.
Maybe we'll come up with something a little more ambitious than that, but
See y'all next week.